I stood in the marble lobby of the Ritz-Carlton with my laptop bag cutting into my shoulder. Through the open mahogany doors of the private dining room, I watched my father raise a glass of champagne. He was looking right at a table of angel investors, telling them that my brother Chase was the sole genius behind the proprietary logistics software they were about to seed with $2 million. Chase sat there smiling, wearing a tailored suit bought with my parents' retirement savings. He could not write a single line of basic code if his life depended on it. I spent 3 years building that software on nights and weekends. But a month ago, my parents cornered me at a family barbecue with a stack of documents they swore were just standard tax filings. Now, my father was subtly signaling the hotel security guard to escort me out into the freezing rain before I could ruin his son's big moment. What none of them knew was that I held the only registered patent under an anonymous shell company, and the software they were presenting required an active license key that I was about to permanently revoke. My name is Clara, and I am 28 years old. Before I show you exactly how I dismantled their fake empire, let me know your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. And if you have ever watched a toxic family member steal your hard work while everyone else applauded them, hit the like button and subscribe to Sweet Karma Life. Trust me, you are going to want to hear every single detail of this reckoning. To understand how my own parents could hand my life's work over to a man who spent his 20s playing video games, you have to understand the hierarchy of our household. I am the scapegoat. Chase is the golden child. He is 30 years old and has never held a job for more than 6 consecutive months. Every failure is always someone else's fault. A boss was unfair, a market was too slow, or the economy just did not appreciate his vision. When his cryptocurrency investments wiped out his savings, my parents let him move into their basement rent-free. When he leased a sports car he could not afford to maintain an image of success, my mother quietly made the monthly payments. I lived on the other side of town in a walk-up apartment. I worked 60 hours a week as a lead software architect. My parents rarely asked about my career. To my father, a retired construction manager, writing code was just typing on a computer. It was not real labor. It did not matter that I had a master's degree or that I managed a team of junior developers. I was just the quiet daughter who fixed their router when the internet went down. Everything shifted 8 months ago. I made the mistake of visiting my parents' house for Sunday dinner. I sat at the kitchen table, picking at a plate of roast chicken, and casually mentioned that a side project I was developing had just entered beta testing. I called it Project Nexus. It was an algorithm designed to streamline warehouse shipping routes, cutting delivery times by 20%. I told them 2 regional shipping companies were already testing the prototype and seeing unprecedented results. I saw the exact moment the calculation happened in my father's eyes. He looked at me, then looked down the hall toward the basement door where Chase was sleeping at 2 in the afternoon. The following week, my phone started ringing. My father, who usually only called me on holidays, suddenly wanted to grab coffee. He started talking about how family builds wealth together. He suggested that I bring Chase on board as a business consultant. He said Chase had a natural charisma for sales and could help me scale the operation. I took a sip of my black coffee and looked across the cafe table. I told him no. I reminded him that Chase did not know the first thing about logistics or software infrastructure. That was when the mask dropped. My father leaned forward, his voice low and tight. He told me I was being selfish. He reminded me that he and my mother paid for a portion of my college tuition, framing my childhood as a debt I was now refusing to repay. When I stood up to leave, he did not follow me. He just watched me walk out the door. The loud demands stopped after that day. I thought I had set a boundary and won. I was wrong. The direct attacks ended because they realized forcing me would not work. So, they decided to change tactics. They decided to play the supportive parents. The pivot was subtle at first. A few days after our argument at the coffee shop, my doorbell rang. It was a Tuesday night, well past 9 o'clock. I opened the door to find my mother standing in the hallway, holding a brown paper bag smelling of garlic and roasted vegetables. She had never visited my apartment on a weeknight. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the cramped living room. I had a folding table set up against the far wall, supporting 3 monitors, a tower server, and empty coffee cups. She did not sneer at the mess. Instead, she set the food on the kitchen counter, smiled warmly, and asked how my little warehouse project was coming along. It was a calculated performance. She was gathering intelligence. To comprehend why my parents needed to change tactics so drastically, you need to see what was happening back at their house. Chase was drowning, and his facade was getting expensive. For the past 2 years, he had branded himself as a venture capitalist and day trader. The reality was much bleaker. He operated out of my parents' finished basement. He had convinced my father to let him invest a significant chunk of his retirement pension into unregulated cryptocurrency markets. When those markets crashed, Chase did not admit defeat. He doubled down on the aesthetic of wealth. He signed a lease on a slate gray Audi he parked in their driveway. He wore tailored blazers to coffee shops to take video calls that went nowhere. My mother was secretly paying the car insurance and the credit card minimums to keep his fragile ego intact. I knew all this because Chase had the audacity to ask me for a loan 2 weeks prior. He had showed up at my apartment, leaned against the doorframe, and asked for $500 to cover a networking dinner. He told me he was closing a large real estate syndication deal and just needed liquid cash for the weekend. I looked at his designer shoes, then at my own frayed sneakers, and closed the door in his face. Now, standing in my kitchen, my mother was laying the groundwork for a different kind of extraction. She unpacked the plastic containers. She told me I looked tired. She said I was working too hard at my day job and that she was proud I was exploring entrepreneurial avenues. The word felt unnatural coming from her mouth. It was a word Chase used. A month went by. I continued working my 60-hour weeks at the architecture firm. Every evening, I came home, ate a cold dinner, and sat in front of my monitors until 2 a.m. Project Nexus was no longer just a concept. It was a fully functional prototype. The algorithm was complex, handling live data streams from delivery trucks and calculating the most efficient routes in real time. The 2 regional shipping companies running the beta test reported a significant drop in fuel costs. The data was undeniable. The software worked. One Friday afternoon, I received an email from the director of operations at one of those logistics companies. They wanted to transition from the free beta test to a paid licensing agreement. They offered an initial contract of $100,000 for the first year. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen, my hands shaking. The years of isolation, the discarded weekends, the sleep deprivation, it was finally turning into something real. That Sunday, I attended another family dinner. I should have kept my mouth shut. I should have eaten the meal and gone home. But I was exhausted and proud. When my father asked how the typing was going, I let my guard down. I told them about the contract offer. I told them about the 6-figure valuation for a single licensing agreement. The dining room went dead silent. Chase stopped chewing his food. He set his fork down, his eyes darting between me and our parents. The dynamic in the room shifted so violently, you could feel the air pressure drop. A daughter who fixes routers does not secure $100,000 contracts. Only the golden child was supposed to do that. My father cleared his throat. He did not congratulate me. Instead, his brow furrowed in deep manufactured concern. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He asked if I knew anything about corporate liability. He asked what would happen if a delivery truck got into an accident while using my routing software. Could the victims sue me personally? Could they take my apartment? Could they garnish my wages at the architecture firm? He fired the questions rapidly, not giving me a chance to answer. It was a deliberate strategy to induce panic. I told him the software was just a tool, not a driver, but he shook his head. He looked at my mother, who mirrored his grave expression. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. She said the corporate world was dangerous for a young woman working all alone. She said people would try to take advantage of my lack of business experience. Then Chase spoke up. He leaned forward, adopting a calm, authoritative tone. He told me I had a good little product, but scaling it required a real business mind. He offered to step in and handle the client relations. He said he could negotiate the contract up to $200,000 if I gave him a seat at the table. I pulled my hand away from my mother. I looked Chase in the eye and told him I did not need a salesman. I told him the data sold itself. The rejection hung in the air. Chase flushed red, his jaw clenching. He abruptly pushed his chair back, stood up, and walked out of the room without another word. My father watched him leave, his jaw set. He turned back to me, the concerned patriarch act dissolving into cold calculation. He did not yell. He spoke in a low, measured voice. He told me I was being foolish and arrogant. He said if I wanted to play business, I needed to protect myself legally. He mentioned a man named Greg, an old golfing buddy who worked as a certified public accountant. My father said he was going to have Greg draw up some standard protective paperwork. He said it was the responsible thing to do, and as my father, he would not sit by and watch me ruin my future over a liability lawsuit. I was tired. The adrenaline of the contract offer had faded, replaced by the familiar, exhausting weight of my family's relentless pressure. I agreed to look at the paperwork. It seemed like a reasonable compromise to get them off my back. That was my second mistake. I did not realize that the paperwork was already drafted. I did not realize that a trap had been set, and I was walking straight into the jaws of a corporate theft they had been planning since the moment I mentioned the word beta test. The shift in their strategy was terrifyingly smooth. If my parents had continued to demand my software code, I would have kept my walls up. I would have ignored their calls and stayed in my apartment. But they knew me better than that. They knew the exact currency I had been starved of my entire life. Validation. 2 weeks after the disastrous Sunday dinner, my phone rang. It was my father. He sounded different. His voice was lighter, stripped of the usual gravelly authority he used when giving orders. He invited me to a family barbecue for the upcoming Labor Day weekend. He told me he had been thinking about our last conversation and realized he had been too harsh. He said he was just worried about his daughter navigating the corporate shark tank alone. Then he added the hook. He mentioned he had invited his old friend Greg to the cookout. Greg was a fixture from my childhood, a certified public accountant who handled the books for all the local contractors in my father's orbit. Greg always wore golf shirts that stretched too tight across his chest and drove a luxury sedan he complained about paying for. He was the guy you called when you needed to make a zoning fine vanish or when you wanted to claim a family vacation as a business expense. I did not trust Greg, but my father framed the invitation as a casual favor. He said Greg was just going to look over my beta testing contracts over a plate of ribs, just to make sure I was not getting taken advantage of by the logistics companies. I drove to their suburban house that Saturday afternoon. The air was thick with late summer humidity. When I walked through the side gate into the backyard, the scene looked like a television commercial for the perfect American family. My father was flipping burgers on the stainless steel grill. Chase was sitting in a patio chair, wearing designer sunglasses, sipping a premium imported beer. My mother was arranging bowls of potato salad on the picnic table. When she saw me, she dropped the serving spoon and rushed over, pulling me into a tight embrace. It was the kind of hug she usually reserved for Chase when he announced a new imaginary business venture. She pulled back, holding my shoulders, and looked at me with shining eyes. She told me she was so proud of the woman I had become. She said she bragged to her friends at the tennis club about her brilliant daughter building complex computer systems. It was a dizzying reversal. For 28 years, I was the invisible child. Now I was the center of their universe. The psychological warfare was working. My defenses began to lower. After we ate, my father wiped his hands on a towel and gestured toward the glass patio table. Greg was already sitting there, opening a thick leather briefcase. My father pulled out a chair for me. He placed a heavy, reassuring hand on my shoulder. He told me they had been reviewing the landscape of tech startups, and they wanted to help me build a fortress around my assets. Greg slid a thick stack of stapled papers across the glass. He spoke fast, using a dense layer of financial jargon designed to confuse rather than clarify. He talked about limited liability thresholds, corporate tax shelters, and personal asset shields. He told me that operating as a sole proprietor was financial suicide. If a delivery truck using my routing algorithm crashed, the victims could sue me for everything I owned. He tapped the top page with an expensive pen. He said these documents would transfer my beta testing contracts into a protected corporate entity. I tried to read the paragraphs, but the text was dense with legalese. Every time I paused on a page, my father would tap the table impatiently. He said the meat was getting cold. He said Greg was doing them a massive favor by drafting this up on a holiday weekend, and we should not waste his time. Then, my mother deployed her final weapon. She walked over, carrying a tray of iced tea. She set a glass down in front of me, letting her hand rest softly against my cheek. She told me she knew I had worked so hard, and she just wanted to see me safe. She said our family protects our own. I looked at the three of them. My father, standing tall like a protective shield. My mother, radiating fake maternal warmth. And Greg, holding out the blue ink pen. For a split second, I wanted to believe the illusion. I wanted to believe I finally had a family that cared about my success. I took the pen. I flipped to the back pages where the yellow sticky notes indicated the signature lines. I signed my name 4 times. The moment the ink dried, the atmosphere in the backyard shifted. The warmth evaporated. My father quickly scooped up the documents, slid them into a manila envelope, and handed them to Greg. Chase, who had been quiet the entire time, suddenly stood up from his chair. He stretched his arms, flashed a bright, arrogant smile, and announced he was going inside to check the baseball scores. The performance was over. They had what they wanted. I drove home that evening with a cold knot forming in my stomach. The validation I felt an hour ago had turned to ash. I tried to push the feeling down, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I went back to work. I spent the next week coding updates for the logistics companies and managing my team at the architecture firm. But the knot in my stomach did not go away. 7 days after the barbecue, I sat at my home desk at 3 a.m. The glow of the monitors illuminated the dark room. I opened my web browser and navigated to the Secretary of State website. I clicked on the corporate registry search bar. My hands felt numb as I typed my own name. No results found. I frowned, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. I typed in the address of my apartment. No results. Finally, I typed my father's home address. A single result populated on the screen. The entity name was listed as Nexus Tech Holdings. The status was active. I clicked the link to download the public filing documents. The PDF loaded line by line. I stared at the screen, reading the letters over and over until they blurred together. The documents I signed were not a tax shelter. They were articles of incorporation and a binding operating agreement. Chase was listed as the Chief Executive Officer. Under the equity distribution chart, his name sat next to 100% ownership. My father was listed as the registered agent. I kept scrolling, my chest tight, fighting for breath. I found my signature on the final page. It was attached to a supplementary vendor contract. I was not an owner. I was not a partner. I was explicitly classified as an at-will independent contractor. I had surrendered all legal rights, all future royalties, and all creative control of Project Nexus. The betrayal was surgical. They did not just want a piece of my success. They wanted to erase me from it entirely. They had conspired with an accountant to legally steal my software so Chase could parade around the city pretending to be a tech founder. They used my desperate need for their love as the bait. I sat in the dark for a long time. The silence of the apartment pressed in on me. A normal person would have picked up the phone, called their parents, and screamed. A normal person would have driven to that suburban house and thrown rocks through the windows. I did neither. I reached across my desk and picked up a small, silver-framed photograph. It was the only picture I kept of our family. I stared at their smiling faces under the harsh blue light of my monitors. I did not cry. I simply opened my phone, navigated to my emergency contacts, and deleted my parents' numbers. Then, I dropped the silver frame directly into the metal trash can by my feet. It hit the bottom with a dull, final thud. As I looked back at the stolen corporate registry, the pain slowly hardened into something else. Cold, sharp clarity. If I screamed, I would just be the hysterical daughter. They would gaslight me, tell me I misunderstood the paperwork, and use my anger to prove I was too unstable to run a company anyway. I realized I could not fight a paper trail with emotions. If they wanted to play a game of corporate warfare, I needed to rewrite the rules. I closed the browser window and opened my secure code vault. The shell company might belong to Chase, but the underlying architecture still lived on my servers, and it was time to build a trap of my own. I woke up the morning after finding the corporate registry with a strange metallic taste in my mouth. My phone buzzed against the wooden nightstand. The screen lit up with a text message from my mother asking if I wanted to come over for Sunday brunch. A month ago, I would have replied instantly. Yesterday, I would have driven straight to their house, kicked the front door open, and demanded answers. I would have stood in their kitchen, cried, and begged them to explain why I was not enough. That is exactly what they anticipated. They wanted the chaotic, unstable daughter. If I threw a tantrum, my father could shake his head, call me hysterical, and use my emotional outburst to justify taking the company away from me. He would tell his friends and the extended family that I lacked the temperament for business. I stared at the ceiling and made a different choice. I typed a brief reply saying I was busy with the deadline. I set the phone face down. I realized in the silence of that apartment that I was no longer a daughter. I was a mark. And a mark only survives by outsmarting the con artist. On Tuesday during my lunch break, I walked 3 blocks from the architecture firm to a high-rise office building downtown. I booked an hour with my intellectual property attorney, Marcus. I had hired him 8 months ago, right before Project Nexus entered beta testing, because I do not leave my assets unprotected. I sat in his glass-walled office and slid the printed state registry documents across his mahogany desk. I explained how my family had conspired with their accountant to strip me of my equity in the operating company. Marcus reviewed the forged paperwork. He did not look concerned. Instead, he offered a thin, razor-sharp smile. He leaned back in his leather chair and tapped the documents. He reminded me of the provisional patent we had locked in the federal database 6 months prior under my anonymous Delaware entity, Architect Holdings. Marcus explained that my father had built a trap based on a fundamental misunderstanding of technology. My father thought software was like a physical building. You sign a deed, you own the building. But code is a living language. He had tricked me into signing away my rights to Nexus Tech Holdings, but that entity only possessed the compiled version of the software running on the servers. They had stolen an empty house. I still owned the blueprints, the foundation, and the land beneath it. Because I had never shared the underlying source code or the raw mathematical logic with anyone, the core patent was bulletproof. My family thought they had successfully stolen my life's work, but they had merely stolen a corporate shell. I walked out of the law office feeling a heavy, cold armor settling over my shoulders. The legal trap was already set, long before they even knew we were playing a game. Legal protection was only half the battle. I needed to ensure my family could not simply walk away with the compiled code and lock me out of my own creation. That night, I brewed a pot of black coffee and sat at my multi-monitor setup. I did not need to hack into anything or write malicious software. I was the architect. The Nexus framework was already designed with an enterprise-grade digital rights management protocol. It is a standard industry practice to protect proprietary software from unauthorized use. The algorithm required an active, encrypted license key to function. Every 7 days, The live servers had to ping my Secure Architect Holdings database to verify the user had the legal and financial right to operate the software. If the ping failed, or if I manually revoked the vendor license due to non-payment, the system would immediately initiate a compliance lockdown. The user interface would freeze, displaying a copyright violation notice, and the routing capabilities would vanish. I opened my administrative dashboard and linked the active beta license directly to Nexus Tech Holdings. I was not installing a trap. I was simply enforcing a vendor contract. If they wanted to use my blueprints, they had to pay the architect. At 3 a.m, I closed my laptop. The vault was sealed. 2 weeks later, my parents hosted a dinner to celebrate the official launch of Nexus Tech Holdings. I drove to the suburbs, parked my car behind the leased Audi, and walked through the front door carrying a bottle of red wine. The dining room table was set with the fine china my mother usually reserved for Thanksgiving. Chase sat at the head of the table. He wore a crisp blue button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms to project a hard-working aesthetic. My father was pouring wine, his chest puffed out with pride. When I walked in, the room grew slightly tense. They were waiting for me to crack. They were waiting for me to bring up the paperwork or ask about my equity. I did not give them the satisfaction. I handed my mother the wine, smiled warmly, and took my seat. I asked Chase how the executive life was treating him. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, searching my face for sarcasm. Finding none, his ego took over. He leaned back, swirled his wine, and launched into a monologue about market penetration and synergistic partnerships. He used phrases he had clearly memorized from an audiobook. He talked about revolutionizing the logistics industry. My father nodded along, captivated by his son's manufactured brilliance. My mother patted his arm, her eyes shining with validation. I sat there, cutting my steak, eating quietly. I watched them perform this elaborate play. I felt no anger. I felt no sadness. I felt nothing but clinical detachment. I was looking at 3 strangers. After dessert, Chase cleared his throat and addressed me directly. He adopted a magnanimous tone, playing the generous chief executive throwing a bone to a lowly worker. He said they were going to keep me on board as a technical consultant. He explained that since I built the initial framework, I would be useful for maintaining the servers and fixing minor bugs. He promised to pay me a fair hourly rate, framing it as a favor to his little sister. He wanted me to be his permanent, invisible mechanic. I looked at his smug expression, then at my father's watchful eyes. I wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, smiled gently, and told him I would be happy to help. I agreed to handle all the back-end maintenance. What Chase failed to realize was that an executive who cannot read code is at the mercy of the person who writes it. He had the title, the tailored shirts, and the corporate bank account, but the product was a ticking time bomb, and he had just handed me the detonator. The real problem for Chase was about to begin. Beta software is notorious for one specific thing. It breaks. And when it did, the fake founder was going to find himself staring at a screen of errors he could not comprehend, forcing him to crawl back to me. The illusion of success is incredibly expensive to maintain. Once Chase possessed the legal title of Chief Executive Officer, he wasted no time stepping into the costume. He did not spend his days studying the logistics industry or analyzing the beta testing metrics. Instead, he signed a commercial lease for an office space in the trendy downtown arts district. The suite featured exposed brick walls, a glass conference room, and polished concrete floors. He purchased a wardrobe of bespoke wool suits that cost $2,000 each. Because the Nexus software was still in the unpaid beta phase, generating 0 actual revenue, this lifestyle required a massive influx of capital. Chase did not secure a business grant. He went to the bank with my father. Richard used his retirement pension as collateral and took out a second mortgage on the family home. My mother quietly drained her savings accounts. They co-signed high-interest commercial loans to fund a theatrical production where their golden child could play the starring role. while Chase sat in his empty, expensive office taking selfies for his social media profiles. I continued to work my demanding day job. At night, I monitored the Nexus servers for my apartment. A complex software ecosystem is a living organism. It requires constant surveillance and tuning. Memory leaks occur. Database queries bottleneck during peak traffic hours. Chase did not know what a database query was. He treated the software like a magic box that simply functioned on command. The first inevitable crash happened on a rainy Thursday night. One of our regional shipping clients attempted to integrate a new fleet of delivery trucks into the routing algorithm. Their outdated legacy system sent a corrupted data packet to our servers. The Nexus framework hit a logic fault and triggered a critical system error. The live routing map on the client dashboard went dark. 5 minutes later, my phone chimed with a text message from my mother. She did not ask if I was awake. She did not ask how I was doing. The message dictated that my brother was under a lot of pressure tonight and I needed to be a team player. She told me to handle the technical glitch so Chase could focus on the big picture. My father sent a follow-up text ordering me not to ruin the company momentum over a simple computer bug. They framed my specialized labor as a basic household chore, no different than taking out the trash or folding the laundry. I did not argue with them. I sat up, turned on my multi-monitor setup, and accessed the remote server terminal. I traced the corrupted packet, cleared the cache, and rewrote the parsing logic to automatically filter out bad data from that specific client. The repair took exactly 47 minutes. The green indicator lights returned to the server dashboard. I sent Chase a single text message saying the issue was resolved. I did not go back to sleep. I opened a fresh spreadsheet and designed a formal corporate invoice. I documented the date, the time of the call, the exact nature of the critical system failure, and the specific lines of code I altered. I billed my time at $300 an hour, which is the standard emergency rate for a senior systems architect. I exported the document and emailed it to his new Nexus Tech Holdings corporate address. Chase never paid the invoice. He never even acknowledged receiving it. He treated my late-night labor like an endless well he could draw from without consequence. So, I let him keep drinking. Over the next 3 months, the beta software required constant adjustments. Every time a server lagged, every time a client requested a custom reporting feature, Chase panicked. He called me during my lunch breaks. He texted me on weekend mornings. Every single time, I quietly logged into the system and fixed the issue. And every single time, I generated a highly detailed, itemized invoice and sent it to his inbox. I was building a weapon out of paper. By ignoring those invoices, Chase was creating a documented, undeniable record of his own technical illiteracy. The billing history proved he could not manage the fundamental product of his own company. It established a clear pattern that he relied entirely on an unpaid independent contractor to keep the lights on. I printed every invoice and placed them in a heavy black binder on my desk. The ledger grew thicker every week, a silent testament to the fraud taking place. Unaware of the paper trail slowly tightening around his neck, Chase grew bolder. Armed with a functional product that yielded incredible data, he started hunting for venture capital. He desperately needed a massive cash injection to cover the mounting debt of his office lease and his luxury car payments. He began scheduling pitch meetings with investment firms across the city. Before every pitch, he called me. He asked me to explain the software architecture again so he could sound smart in the boardroom. I fed him the exact phrases investors love to hear. Machine learning optimization, predictive latency models, asynchronous data pipelines. I listened to him repeat the words back to me, stumbling over the syllables. He was a parrot sitting on a pirate's shoulder, mimicking a language he did not comprehend. The strategy somehow worked. The logistics data was so strong that the investors looked past the hollow vessel delivering the pitch. In late November, Chase called my parents' house, yelling with excitement. He had hooked a whale. A prominent angel investor named Julian had reviewed the beta metrics and wanted to host an exclusive live demo dinner. This was not a closing dinner, but the critical founder evaluation before his legal team would begin formal due diligence for a massive seed funding round. $2 million was on the table. It was the kind of money that would instantly erase my parents' crippling debt and cement Chase as a Silicon Valley success story. $2 million. That was the figure hanging in the air. For a legitimate technology startup, securing a lead seed investor is a standard milestone on the path to scaling operations. For my family, it was a desperate rescue boat. Chase was drowning in commercial lease payments and high-interest business loans. My parents were staring down a second mortgage they could barely afford to service. If Julian offered a term sheet, the crushing debt vanished instantly. Chase would become a certified tech mogul. My parents would become the proud architects of his success. The pressure within their household must have been suffocating. I knew the demo dinner was real long before they told me about it. I had been monitoring the server analytics from my apartment. The investor's technical team was conducting their preliminary stress test on the logistics framework, pushing dummy data through the routing algorithm to see if it would break. The code held up flawlessly. The processing times were unprecedented. Julian wanted the product. He just needed to evaluate the executive team in person before unleashing his lawyers for official due diligence. 2 days before the scheduled pitch dinner, my phone rang. It was my father. He asked me to stop by the house after I finished my shift at the architecture firm. He framed the request as a casual strategy session, claiming we needed to align our vision before the big night. I drove to the suburbs under a heavy, overcast sky. The leased Audi was parked in the driveway, looking shiny and expensive against the backdrop of my parents' aging house. I walked through the front door and immediately felt the shift in gravity. The living room felt staged. Chase was pacing near the brick fireplace, holding a glass of bourbon, refusing to look in my direction. My father sat in his oversized leather armchair, his posture rigid. My mother was perched on the edge of the floral sofa, twisting a paper napkin around her fingers. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken panic. They were on the verge of securing generational wealth, and I was the final loose end they needed to tie up. My father cleared his throat. He did not offer me a drink or ask about my day. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and adopted a somber, clinical tone. He started by offering a hollow compliment, stating that the software metrics looked solid. Then the pivot arrived. He explained that venture capital dinners were a vastly different arena than writing code in a dark room. They required a specific type of personality. He looked at me with manufactured pity. He told me I was too introverted. He said I spent my entire life behind a screen and lacked the social agility to navigate a high-stakes financial negotiation. Investors want a face, he said, keeping his voice low and steady. They want charisma. They want a visionary they can trust with their capital. He pointed toward the fireplace. Chase has that natural magnetism. You are brilliant with the technical details, but your presence in that room would confuse the dynamic. We cannot risk a social misstep costing us this deal. The gaslighting was masterful. I built the product from scratch. I maintained the servers. I fixed every single bug. Yet my father sat in his living room, looking me in the eye, and told me my personality would ruin the company. He was erasing my ownership and framing it as a protective measure for the family. He wanted to lock the mechanic in the garage while he sold the sports car. My mother nodded in fervent agreement. She stood up, walked over, and patted my knee. She offered a tight, reassuring smile that did not reach her eyes. She told me the corporate world was cutthroat and she just wanted to protect me from the stress of answering difficult financial questions. Then she delivered the final insult. She promised that once the funding cleared and the ink was dry, they would make sure I was taken care of. "We will buy you a nice new laptop, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Top of the line, whatever you need for your little coding projects." They waited for my reaction. They expected the familiar script to play out. They anticipated that I would argue, cry, list my endless contributions, and demand my rightful seat at the table. If I lost my temper, they could point fingers, call me difficult, and use my emotional response to justify their decision to exclude me. It was a trap designed to make me look volatile. I looked at the three of them. Chase was staring at the floorboards, hiding behind his drink, displaying the cowardice of a man who lets his parents do his dirty work. My father had his jaw set, ready for a verbal fight. My mother kept her hand resting on my knee, projecting fake maternal warmth. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I let a long, heavy silence fill the room, forcing them to sit in their own discomfort. I felt the cold, sharp armor of my legal preparations settle over me. I smiled calmly. I looked my father directly in the eyes and spoke in a steady, even register. "Okay," I said softly. "I understand. I will not get in Chase's way." The tension in the living room evaporated in an instant. My father let out a long breath, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. Chase finally looked up, a wave of profound relief washing over his face. My mother squeezed my knee and told me I was being such a mature, supportive sister. They truly believed they had won. They thought they had successfully boxed the scapegoat out of the payday without firing a single shot. I stood up, gathered my coat, and wished Chase good luck with his big pitch. I walked out to my car, started the engine, and drove away from the suburban illusion. What my family failed to realize was that I never needed their permission to attend the dinner. I already possessed the entire itinerary. 3 weeks earlier, Chase had panicked over a minor formatting issue in his corporate email signature. In his technical illiteracy, he handed over his master login credentials so I could fix the HTML code. He never bothered to change the password. I had been quietly reading his direct correspondence with the venture capital firm for nearly a month. I knew the dinner was taking place in the private dining room of the Ritz-Carlton. I knew the reservation was booked for 8 o'clock on Thursday evening. Most importantly, I knew the name of the lead investor evaluating the deal. A man named Julian. My family thought they were leaving me behind in the dark, safe and out of sight. They had no idea I was already holding the matches, checking my watch, and waiting for the right moment to burn their fake empire to the ground. Thursday evening arrived with a bitter, freezing rain that washed the city streets in a dull gray light. I stood under the heavy brass awning of the Ritz-Carlton, letting the valet open the heavy glass doors for me. The air inside smelled of roasted cedar and expensive floral arrangements. I was not wearing my usual oversized sweater and frayed sneakers. I wore a tailored black blazer, a silk blouse, and leather heels that clicked sharply against the marble floor. Under my arm, I carried a thick black leather portfolio. It contained the exact instruments needed to dismantle a fraud. I did not stop at the host stand. I knew the layout of the restaurant from reading my brother's unencrypted emails. I walked down a long, dimly lit hallway lined with vintage wine cellars. At the far end of the corridor, a set of heavy mahogany doors stood slightly ajar. I could hear the muted sound of crystal clinking and the low, confident hum of a successful business negotiation. I paused just outside the doorframe. Through the narrow opening, I saw the private dining room. It was an opulent space, lit by a low chandelier. A long table was covered in white linen, silver cutlery, and half-empty plates of prime rib. At the head of the table sat Julian. He was a man in his late 50s with silver hair, wearing a sharp charcoal suit. He radiated the quiet, predatory calm of a man who controls millions of dollars. Flanking him were 2 junior analysts from his venture capital firm, taking notes on digital tablets. Opposite Julian sat my family. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime. Chase wore his bespoke navy suit, leaning back in his chair with a glass of champagne in his hand. He was laughing at a joke Julian just told. My mother sat next to him, wearing a string of pearls and a radiant, practiced smile. My father sat on his other side, playing the role of the proud, stoic patriarch. They looked like a dynasty on the verge of coronation. Chase raised his glass. He cleared his throat, projecting his voice to command the room. He proposed a toast to the future of logistics, to disruptive innovation, and to lucrative partnerships. I pushed the mahogany doors open. The heavy wood swung inward with a soft, distinct click that cut through the sound of the toast. Every head at the table turned toward the entrance. The visual impact of my arrival hit my family like a physical blow. The color drained from my brother's face so fast his skin took on a sickly, chalky hue. His hand trembled, splashing a few drops of champagne onto the white tablecloth. My mother froze, her smile hardening into a rigid, terrified grimace. My father reacted with the pure instinct of a man losing control of his house. He stood up immediately, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. The mask of the sophisticated businessman vanished, replaced by the tight jaw and flared nostrils of the bully I grew up with. He took 2 fast steps toward me, attempting to physically block my path to the table. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a harsh, venomous whisper intended only for my ears. He ordered me to turn around and walk out the door. He signaled the waiter standing near the corner of the room, snapping his fingers and pointing toward the exit. In the past, that tone would have paralyzed me. I would have folded inward, apologized, and retreated. But tonight, I felt nothing but a cold, steady rhythm in my chest. I did not shrink. I did not break eye contact. I simply stepped around him. I walked straight past my father and approached the head of the table. Julian lowered his champagne glass. He did not look annoyed. He looked curious. The junior analysts stopped typing on their tablets. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. I stopped a few feet from Julian. I kept my posture straight and my voice entirely level. I introduced myself. I told him my name was Clara. I stated clearly that I was the lead software architect, the sole developer, and the true creator of the Nexus framework he was currently evaluating. Julian tilted his head. He looked at Chase, who was now sweating visibly under the chandelier light, and then looked back at me. He folded his hands on the table and waited for me to continue. I unzipped the leather portfolio. I pulled out a stack of crisp, white documents. I slid them across the table, stopping them right next to Julian's dinner plate. I spoke in a calm, factual cadence, the way a person reads the weather report. I explained that the papers in front of him were certified copies of a Delaware state corporate registry for an entity named Architect Holdings. I explained that the second document was a filed and stamped federal provisional patent for the Nexus routing algorithm. I watched Julian's eyes scan the first page. I told him that the man sitting across from him held the legal title to a hollow shell company. I clarified that Chase did not own the underlying mathematical architecture, nor did he possess the rights to license it to third parties. My father rushed back to the table. His face was flushed red with panic. He tried to reach for the documents, but Julian placed a heavy hand flat over the papers, stopping him. My father stammered. He tried to deploy the exact narrative they had prepared. He told Julian to ignore me. He claimed I was a disgruntled former contractor. He looked at the venture capital team and said with fake sadness that his daughter was going through a severe mental health crisis and was prone to making irrational, jealous outbursts. My mother chimed in, her voice shaking. She told Julian I was just confused and begged for his patience while they handled a private family matter. They were trying to paint me as a hysterical woman to invalidate my evidence. I did not defend myself against their insults. Arguing with a lie only gives it credibility. Instead, I turned my attention away from my parents and focused entirely on my brother. Chase was staring at the documents under Julian's hand. He looked like a cornered animal. I took a step closer to him. The dining room was so quiet, you could hear the rain hitting the window panes. I asked him a single question. I told Chase that since he was the visionary founder of the company, he should have no problem explaining his product to the investors. I asked him to describe how the asynchronous data pipeline resolves latency conflicts when the routing queue hits maximum capacity. It was a fundamental concept. A first-year computer science student could answer it in 3 sentences. Chase opened his mouth, but no sound came out. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching the walls, the ceiling, and finally landing on our father. He was waiting for his dad to save him, just like he had done his entire life. But my father could not write code either. Julian watched this silent exchange. He possessed the sharp instincts of a man who hunted bad investments for a living. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and stared directly at my brother. Julian asked Chase to go ahead and answer the question. Chase swallowed hard. He stuttered, attempting to string together the buzzwords I had fed him over the phone weeks ago. He muttered something about machine learning synergy and dynamic synergy protocols. It was pure nonsense. It was the sound of a man drowning in a language he did not speak. The golden facade was cracking violently in real time. The millions of dollars sitting on the table began to evaporate. But my father was not ready to surrender. He slammed his hand on the table, rattling the silverware. He pointed a finger at me and demanded the hotel staff remove me from the premises immediately. He shouted that the software worked, the metrics were perfect, and the deal was sound. He pointed to the projector screen at the far end of the room, where a live demo of the Nexus dashboard was currently running, showing the green lights of active delivery routes. He told Julian the product was right there on the screen, proving his son was a genius. He challenged me to deny the software was functioning perfectly. He thought the live demo was his ultimate shield. He had no idea that their software access was tied to 87 unpaid vendor invoices, and he had just given me the perfect stage to officially revoke their license. I tapped a single command on my tablet. The red error screen bathed the private dining room in a harsh neon glow. The live routing maps vanished. The words flashed boldly across the projector. License expired. Proprietary architecture revoked due to critical non-payment. The warning hung suspended above the table, reflecting in the polished silverware and the crystal champagne glasses. Julian did not shout. Men who control venture capital funds do not waste calories on anger. They calculate risk and they cut their losses. He stared at the error screen for 5 long seconds. Then he looked down at the Delaware State Registry and the provisional patent resting next to his dinner plate. He picked up his linen napkin, wiped the corners of his mouth, and tossed the fabric onto the table. He stood up. He buttoned the center button of his charcoal jacket with slow, deliberate precision. Julian looked at my brother. The investor did not see a tech founder anymore. He saw a massive legal liability. He saw a man wearing a costume. Julian nodded once to his junior analysts. The 2 young men moved in perfect synchronization. They tapped the screens of their tablets, closed the leather folios, and placed their pens into their breast pockets. The sound of those folios snapping shut echoed through the silent room like a judge bringing down a wooden gavel. My father stepped forward, holding his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. He begged Julian to wait. He promised the system was just experiencing a minor glitch and that they could reboot the servers in 5 minutes. He offered to lower the valuation, to give up more equity, to do whatever it took to keep the $2 million on the table. Julian paused at the mahogany doors. He turned his head slightly, fixing my father with a gaze so cold it lowered the temperature of the room. Julian stated that he does not invest in stolen assets. He advised my father to hire a very good defense attorney because attempting to defraud an investor during a formal pitch carries severe federal penalties. Then Julian walked out into the corridor. His analysts followed him. The heavy wooden doors swung shut, sealing my family inside the tomb they built for themselves. The vacuum left by the departing investors was instantly filled with panic. Without an audience to perform for, the family hierarchy collapsed. My father slammed his hands on the table, knocking over a crystal wine glass that spilled dark red liquid across the white linen. He screamed at Chase, his face purple with rage, demanding to know how his golden boy could be stupid enough to pitch a room full of investors without securing the actual source code. Chase shoved his chair back, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger at our father. He immediately shifted the blame, screaming that the faulty legal paperwork and the fake accountant were our father's fault. They stood there, 2 grown men in luxury suits, shouting over a puddle of spilled wine, fighting over the corpse of a company they never built. My mother stepped into the crossfire. She saw the empire burning and reverted to her oldest, most reliable strategy: manipulation. She turned away from the screaming match and rushed toward me, her eyes filled with rapid, manufactured tears. She reached out, attempting to grab my forearms. I took a single step backward, leaving her hands grasping at empty air. She clasped her hands over her heart, her breathing ragged. She dropped her voice to a pathetic, pleading whisper. She told me I had made my point. She admitted I was the smart one. Then, she begged me to type the command line into my tablet and turn the servers back on. She promised we could renegotiate the operating agreement right now. She offered me 50% of the equity. She used the word family 4 times in 3 sentences, trying to weaponize the very concept she had used to exclude me just 48 hours ago. I watched her perform. I felt no pity. I felt no desire for revenge. I felt only a profound, peaceful detachment. I unzipped my leather portfolio for the second time tonight. I told my mother that Nexus Tech Holdings was dead. I pulled out a thick, heavy black folder and placed it flat on the dining table, right on top of the spilled wine. The loud slap of the folder hitting the wood silenced the screaming match between my father and my brother. They both turned to look at the new evidence. I addressed my father. I told him to open it. He hesitated, his hands shaking slightly, and flipped the heavy cover open. Inside were 87 pieces of paper. Each one was a formal, itemized invoice. I explained the contents in a steady, level voice. I told them those pages documented every single hour of emergency labor I performed over the last 3 months. Every late-night server crash, every database repair, every line of code rewritten. I pointed out that I billed my services at $300 an hour, the standard industry rate for an independent contractor. I informed them the total unpaid debt sat at just over $60,000. And because I was legally classified by their own paperwork as an independent vendor, that debt belonged to the corporate entity Chase was currently running into the ground. My father flipped through the pages, his breathing shallow. Tucked into the very back of the folder was a document printed on heavy stock paper bearing the letterhead of my intellectual property attorney. I told them it was a formal cease and desist order. I laid out the final terms of their reality. If they ever attempted to reboot the software, if they tried to pitch the routing algorithm to another firm, or if they so much as mentioned the Nexus name in a business setting, my lawyer would file federal charges for corporate espionage and fraud. Chase sank into his chair, dropping his head into his hands. He was hyperventilating. I walked him through the math he was too terrified to calculate himself. I reminded him that he signed a 3-year commercial lease on a downtown office space. I reminded my father that he co-signed a massive business loan against his pension to pay for the custom suits, the sports car, and the lavish executive lunches. They built an elaborate, expensive stage production. But the curtain had just fallen, the audience had gone home, and they were left holding the bills for a show that was permanently canceled. They had 0 product, 0 investors, and crippling monthly payments they could never afford. My mother covered her mouth, a genuine sob finally escaping her throat. My father stared blindly at the pile of invoices, the color draining from his face as the financial ruin settled over him. Chase kept his face buried in his hands, unable to look at the sister he tried to erase. I did not wait for an apology. An apology requires a conscience, and I knew they possessed none. I picked up my tablet, slipped it back into my portfolio, and zipped it closed. I turned my back on my family. I walked across the room, the heels of my shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. I did not look over my shoulder. I pushed the mahogany doors open and walked out of the hotel, leaving them sitting in the quiet, expensive wreckage of their own greed. 6 months is a very short amount of time for an empire to fall, when there is no foundation to support the weight. But I did not stay to watch them drown. I booked a flight to Boston, secured a meeting with a prominent logistics investment group, and sold the proprietary architecture outright for a life-changing sum. They hired me as a senior technical consultant, and I now direct a team of brilliant developers who actually understand the language we speak. It is a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 year since I walked out of that hotel dining room. The morning air in Boston carries a sharp chill, But inside my paid-off condo, it is warm and entirely quiet. I trace the rim of my ceramic coffee mug, watching the harbor ferries cut through the slate-gray water far below my private balcony. There is no clutter. There is no chaos. I hear through the periphery of extended relatives that gravity worked remarkably fast on my family. When the commercial rent check bounced, it triggered a rapid cascade of financial ruin. Chase was blacklisted from the venture capital world. He filed for bankruptcy, lost his leased sports car, and was forced to pack his bespoke suits into cardboard boxes and move right back into our parents' basement. He is 31 years old now, working an entry-level retail job to pay off his settlements. My parents did not escape the blast radius. The corporate creditors initiated foreclosure on my childhood home, forcing my father to drain his entire pension just to keep a roof over their heads. They are chained to the anchor they created, sinking slowly together in a house they can barely afford to maintain. My phone sits on the patio table. It does not vibrate with frantic demands. There are no manipulative text messages. I changed my number the day the buyout funds cleared. I feel no guilt over their collapse. I feel no triumph either. The only thing resting in my chest is a profound, unshakable peace. Society tells us that blood is a permanent obligation, but as I take a sip of my dark roast coffee and watch the city wake up, I know the truth. Walking away was not a punishment. It was the only way to survive. If you are sitting in the dark right now, watching a toxic family member steal your light, or if you had to burn their fake empire to the ground to protect your peace, let me know in the comments below. If you chose yourself, I am proud of you. Hit the like button and subscribe to Sweet Karma Life for more stories of reclaiming your power. Protect your vault, and I will see you in the next video.